Joining me now is Democratic Congressman Lloyd Doggett from Texas. We've got a lot to talk about, but first, I want to get your reaction to what Speaker Pelosi just said. The fact that she says there is not going to be any wall money in the legislation to avoid a government shutdown. Do you think that's the right position to be taken right now?
I agree with her fully. She's been firm and effective. President Trump has always wanted to run our government through executive fiat. That apparently some kind of fake announcement of an emergency, of a crisis that doesn't exist, will be his approach. He has disparaged this negotiating committee since it first began. I hope we can avoid another shutdown and all the pain that it has cost and the economic growth that it has interfered with through the Trump shutdown. But a wall is just not going to happen.
Congressman, I have heard some Democrats who are on this negotiating committee who don't want to really have a bunch of money going to the wall, saying, though, that they are open to some wall money in order to, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, is basically the argument. You clearly don't see it that way.
There have long been some fences or barriers in urban areas, El Paso, for example, for decades. And if there's some repair or restructuring of those, yes, but the idea of continuing to build a wall across the country, with the president's only compromise being that he would do it with steel instead of concrete and call it a fence instead of a wall, that's not going to happen.
Yeah, it sounds like I wonder, even with what we hear from Nancy Pelosi, if even any repairs is going to be part of that conversation in this legislation. But I do want to get to other news that has been going on and ask you about. In other news, Democrats right now are demanding information from Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin about a potential conflict of interest. You know this, but for our viewers, this is a link between the secretary and a Russian billionaire who was the subject of sanctions. He's a Putin ally. Hefty sanctions were slapped on companies where he has a huge interest in after the 2016 election. These are also sanctions that Mnuchin announced are being lifted despite some big pushback coming from Congress. You think this link between, well, there's a Republican donor and the link to this Russian oligarch presents at the very least a conflict of interest, and that Mnuchin should have recused himself from that decision. Have you heard back a reason why he did not?
Well, I think he should have at least sought some ethics guidance there from in the Treasury Department, and that further information is needed, the very information that my colleagues, the top Democrat on the Senate Finance Committee and the House Oversight Committee, have requested from him. Those are the kind of answers we needed long ago. Kate, as you know, this sanctions law was designed to change Russian behavior. President Trump fought adoption of the bill. He then tried to water it down. He then issued a signing statement to try to limit its effectiveness, and it took months for them to put any sanctions in place, all designed to change Russian behavior. We know that behavior has not changed. Even this morning's announcement from Special Counsel Mueller of the Russian disinformation campaign on the investigation of collusion and obstruction, that the Russians are still actively involved. Their engagement abroad and to undermine our democracy, they haven't changed. All that's changed is that when the Treasury Department finally put a sanction in place, they were willing to come in on a Sunday afternoon and ignore a vote in the House and Senate and undo and lift that sanction. That's wrong, and we do need to know whether Mr. Mnuchin had some personal and family connections with someone who had something to gain out of this transaction.
Well, the Treasury Department spokesman, he spoke to the New York Times, and he says any conflict of interest allegation here is, in his view, absurd. Is this a fishing expedition in response? Because it's not like if Mnuchin had recused himself and they had moved ahead with lifting sanctions, you would have supported that move anyway. Is this a fishing expedition?
No, let me make it clear. I certainly wouldn't have supported lifting these sanctions based on the information we have now. Again, new information coming out again within the last 24 hours that the so-called independent party that they put in to change behavior here is not very independent of Mr. Deripaska, the Russian thug who's a friend of Putin's. But it's not a fishing expedition. In fact, I've asked Mr. Mnuchin this question personally myself. We sought additional time to try to get to the bottom of this and have it be an entirely nonpartisan investigation. Treasury would have no part of that after initially suggesting they were willing to meet with us. They've declined that. Mr. Mnuchin has refused to respond to congressional inquiries or to appear in front of our Ways and Means Committee. It's a sordid deal, and if there weren't a problem with this, he would have engaged, I think, in a very different approach. The bottom line for the American people, though, is they're willing to do extra things to make a Russian company, an ally of Mr. Putin, get them special treatment. They're not willing to protect the American people.
It will be interesting when Mnuchin agrees to appear before your committee to answer questions. The chairman of your committee,
I look forward to it.
The Tax Writing Committee, he has said that he is looking to get Donald Trump's tax returns with the new Democratic majority in the House. How are you going to do that?
Well, you know, I made 6 or 7 motions to our committee that were obstructed by Republicans during the last Congress. And I support the chairman's effort fully to use an almost century-old law that's on the books, that does not require a subpoena, in order to complete the work of our committee on the confidence in the tax system, on whether Donald Trump got special tax breaks that some have estimated may amount to over $1 billion in the tax law that he signed. All it takes is the signature of the chair of our committee to make a request to the Internal Revenue Service. I hope that can happen soon. I believe we should be thorough and careful and nonpartisan in our approach, but we should also be timely. And it's important that we get not only the personal returns, but these complex business transactions the president's been involved in, the many limited partnerships that he's a part of that may have had significant foreign money involved. We need that in order to do the work of our committee.
Real quick, what are the chances you put it out that you're actually going to get his tax returns? Do you put it at anything better than 50-50 right now?
I think the law is very clear that we're entitled to get those returns. If the Treasury Secretary, the same Mr. Mnuchin that has ducked and dodged on the Russian oligarchs, refuses to do it, then we will have to take some court action to get the documents. Right. President Trump, of course, the first president, our presidential candidate in recent memory to not follow through on his initial promise to disclose his returns. He clearly, just as with the Mueller investigation, has something to hide, or he would be engaged with the American people and with our committee, and it wouldn't be necessary to make this request.
And still the American people, without those tax returns, still, and everyone pointing out that he would be the first that did not release those tax returns in the campaign, did not think that it was any reason to not put him in office at that time. Great to see, Congressman.
Yes,
got to go with. Go ahead. Sorry.
Thanks so much, Kate.
Thank you, sir. Thanks for coming in. Much more to come.